because all I need to do is introduce Tamara and Raman from the University of Sheffield, who are going to be talking to us about the adoption of FAIR for research software.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming along to this panel discussion about equipping researchers with FAIR research software skills. I'm Tamara. I'm a research software engineer, and I'm also the FAIR4RS training program manager at the University of Sheffield. Before I introduce our wonderful panel, I'm going to give a brief history of FAIR and FAIR4RS. So FAIR is a concept that came about in 2016 and it was introduced as a guideline for those wishing to enhance the reusability of their data holdings. And it's adequately illustrated in this well-known cartoon from Scriberia, which shows the foundational aspects, which are that data should be findable through IDs and metadata. It should be accessible through the use of standard protocols, interoperable by way of standardized interfaces, and reusable through being well described and with an appropriate license. And from the very start, these principles were intended to apply not only to data, but also to algorithms, tools, and workflows that lead to that data. However, the main focus in the first few years since these principles were brought about was research data. So what happened to research software? A working group was set up to look into the FAIR principles for research software, and they noted that many of the FAIR guiding principles can't really be directly applied because of specific characteristics of software, that its executability, composite nature, and continuous evolution and versioning mean that you have to make some revisions to the original principles. And they proposed some revised FAIR4RS principles which take into account those differences and adjust the underlying guidelines accordingly. And these were introduced to the wider community through a paper which highlights the relevance in terms of increasing transparency, reproducibility, and reusability of research, and which also notes that these principles should be put into practice when software is initially being developed for the best outcomes. And a recent review of the FAIR4RS principles has shown that there's a lot of work going in towards this, and training is a key component of successful adoption of FAIR4RS. And there are a lot of initiatives towards this, such as programs being developed to offer FAIR4RS skills training, tools for assessing fairness of research software, and examples of implementation of the principles, and strategic approaches for supporting FAIR research software. So that brings us to this panel, and I would like to ask this wonderful panel, who represent a range of expertise in this area, to give us a quick, brief introduction, perhaps highlighting your particular expertise or link to FAIR4RS. So Neil, do you want to start us off?
Hi everyone, my name is Neil Chuhong, and I guess I'm one of the people who are responsible for FAIR for research software, along with Dan Katz and Michelle Barker, who are both also at RSEcon this year. So I was the community editor, bringing in all of the different responses that were coming in from the different members, almost 200 members of the community, in the discussions around how we adapt the FAIR principles and trying to turn that into the drafts that were then put out for community feedback. I will probably be most remembered for the person who decided it would be a good idea to renumber I3 to I2, therefore causing confusion amongst the whole FAIR community. So I'm really sorry for that. We might end up fixing that.
Hi, I'm Carlos Martinez. I work as a community manager at the Netherlands eScience Center. I was also involved in the group FAIR4RS, and at the Design Center, I'm one of the people involved in making sure that we, as a center, implement the principles in the projects that we do, and that we preach those practices that those principles need for being implemented to more researchers in the Netherlands and beyond.
So hello everybody, I'm Romain Thomas, I'm the head of RSE at Sheffield. I started a year ago, and before that I was an academic, I was an astronomer. And actually I kind of had to taught those FAIR principles myself, because I was really doing a lot of software and trying to find a way to actually share them. So when I arrived at Sheffield, we started to look at how to actually train people better at doing this, and that's where the program for FAIR4RS software was built by Tamara, and that's why I'm here, because I'm very interested in how to actually teach academics and even younger people to actually do better with software, because it's the main part of research nowadays. It's coming through softwares.
Hello, my name is Sarah Jaffa. I'm a senior research software engineer at the University of Manchester in the central RSE team. In a previous life, I was an astrophysicist as well, very much self-taught coding, and therefore really not very fair. But I've been involved in teaching and training researchers with academic code and software best practices for about 10 years now, which is scary. And I've also recently, over the last 6 months or so, been involved in the new Carpentries Incubator course on FAIR research software skills for academics that was paid for by the UK Reproducibility Network. Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Samantha Wittke. I work at CSC in Finland, and I'm the community manager for the Code Refinery project. And in Code Refinery we teach good enough FAIR research software development practices. And I got into that because as a researcher I visited a Code Refinery workshop, because I was like, what is this? What is this about? Have I need for this? And it really opened up the whole world of like RSE, and now being here is super exciting.
Please welcome our panel. So I'm going to move on to some questions, and I'd like to interleave the questions that I've prepared with any responses or questions, follow-up questions that you might have. So do get onto Canopy, and we'll try and weave those seamlessly in as we go along. So the first question is about FAIR4RS training, design and delivery. And I wanted to ask you about how when FAIR4RS is a very complicated, sort of multifaceted subject, what should we include and what should we leave out of our training programs when time and resources are limited? So maybe I could start off with Sarah.
Hello? Yes, this one also works. Okay. Yeah, so we thought about this a lot recently when designing our FAIR research software course, and we had a sort of initial plan of what the UK Reproducibility Network wanted us to include, but obviously in a short carpentries course you are very tight on time, so some cuts will have to be made. We've done a pilot of this once and got a lot of good feedback. I think the thing we found was that often the FAIR principles and sort of general wider software best practices can get mixed up, and if you have to be clear which one you're talking about. Are you talking about general things that are good for software, general things that are good for research software, or specifically the FAIR principles? Some of them are easier to define than others. I think the first three, the findable, accessible, well, probably those two are reasonably easy to narrow down to what really makes you findable and accessible. Interoperable is a bit more tricky, and reusable is possibly an entire course on its own. So I think that's really the place we struggled. Of the first three are reasonably easy to cut the material down to really focus on that, but the last one is much more subjective. It can depend what kind of skills exist in your research community, what they would be able to reuse, and so I think that one probably depends on the kind of software you're developing and the kind of researchers you're working with.
Yeah, so a lot of context dependence, essentially.
Yeah, I think in that one the best thing is possibly just trying to get that one maybe can't be defined as clearly for research software as it can for data. because in the data terms, reusable does mean, you know, standard formats and those sort of things, but the standard format in one academic community might be completely alien to another academic community. So you need to work with what your researchers are dealing with and get their input on what is reusable to them, rather than us as RSEs saying what we think is reusable in software terms.
Yeah. I wondered if Samantha has any other comments on that through the code refinery training.
So we also struggle with that, like everyone, what to include. I think we have now found a good middle way between including a lot of stuff, but still keeping it also close to what researchers have actually used for. And I think it's really important, like you also said, like to talk about the big picture, make them understand why this is important, why are we here, why are we teaching this, why do we think this is important for you, because they might not have encountered these situations by themselves before. So we as RSEs, we can like give examples about situations they might come across maybe in the future to motivate these trainings.
Does anyone else on the panel want to follow up?
I think it's also important to realize that when we want to train academics to do better software, we have to realize that they are also struggling a lot with finding time, and try to find the shortest way to the FAIR for research software is very difficult, but we have to actually convince them that by doing this, they will actually save a lot of time down the line. And that's what I think they struggle a bit sometimes to realize that, okay, at the beginning it might be a bit painful because you have to learn version control, you have to learn all these new tools, but down the line it will save you so much time and you will actually be able to focus much more on your research and much less on technical things.
Thank you. I think we've got a question from the audience. What tools can you suggest that make this easier?
Is this training or
any implementing FAIR4RS? Yeah.
So for me, in terms of tools and broadening out outside of tools and including infrastructure as well, I think in part it's around your organization's training linking up with the infrastructure that they provide. So if there are code repositories that are being used by your organization, does the training material there link to it to make it easier for people, particularly, as Sarah said, findable and accessible are the easy ones to try and teach. But it's even easier if the tools and infrastructure that's being provided by your university or your research institute link up with that. The more challenging thing is around whether or not you can do things that make it easier to understand whether you're improving the fairness of your software. There are some efforts. Maybe Carlos will talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on in Netherlands eScience Center around helping assess and do metrics. I'm involved in one project called FAIR Impact, which is trying to define some of the metrics. But again, some things are easier to do and some things are harder. I actually think interoperability is the hardest one. But part of it is just making sure that you provide these sort of things. So maybe in direct answer to, I think it's Dan's question, I think version control repositories are really useful. It's really useful if you have some sense of an ability to create identifiers and have tooling that helps you manage the relationship between the different identifiers you're creating. And then the other one is tooling to help improve the generation of metadata, because that's the bit that everyone hates, but it's probably the most important bit for the findable and accessible parts of FAIR.
And if I can add to that one, so I definitely agree with what Neil is saying, that you have to align the training that you have with the infrastructure that you have, with the tools that you have, and you want to keep these aligned. So what we're doing at the eScience Center is that we're developing some training on what we call research software support skills. So all the skills that you need to make your software fair, but also to make it better in general, even if it's not necessarily in terms of fair. So we have some training along those lines. At the same time, we have our templates for building new Python packages that align with the same principles that you're trying. We recommend you use documentation. So on the template, it tells you, it helps you set up your documentation, and also to try to also integrate that with your software management plans. That in your management plan, you say you want to have documentation. So this is how you implement it, and this is how we teach you about it. And if you don't know about documentation, we point you to resources that help you understand that documentation. So it's trying to keep that complete picture together, and that you're teaching, tooling, implementing the same things that you're consistent in that picture.
Yeah, so a real joined-up approach, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. In the interest of time, we'll move on to the next question. Can we go back to slides? Next one. Okay, so this question is about good enough practices. How fair is fair enough for research software? Samantha, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that's a very hard one. It depends, I think. For researchers, I also think every little bit, very little step already counts, because we've heard they do not have time. It's a big thing, and especially if you then read something about, like, to make your research software fair, you have to do this really, really long list of things that might already prevent them from even starting. So to tell also about that every little thing that you do, if you add comments to your code, then maybe write a little bit of documentation that brings you further already, that's already really good. And then next time maybe they do one more step, and that's then also already better than before.
Baby steps. Sarah?
Yeah, I think that really resonates with something we tried to design into the carpentries course, that Alex Nenadic was very good at reminding us about this when we designed exercises and things. We need to think about the phrasing, that it's not, is this fair, is what you're currently working on fair or not fair? It's, how does this help you be more fair? It isn't a yes or no, and we shouldn't criticize code that is not fair as bad code. It is possible to have bad code that meets the FAIR principles and have good code that meets none of them, especially in an academic context, because the motivation, coming back to what you said about motivating researchers, their motivation is different than ours. They want papers and jobs, and we want nice software. So trying to not say that you have to be a certain level of fair, but phrase it as, these are things that can help you be more fair. It shouldn't be a binary, it's a massive list of options you can have to improve your fairness, and whatever works for you at this time. You know, if you're up against a deadline, do the very quick wins. If you have a 3-year-long project, try and put in some of the best practices at the start when you've got more flexibility. And I think that the good enough, again, it depends on the context of the researchers. I think that's going to be the answer for a lot of these questions. But yeah, good enough depends on the researcher and how much time they have. And in the end, really, if we mean at the limit of good enough, it's good enough to satisfy their legal obligations and their funders, which might say absolutely nothing, or might say you need a full software design up front, you need it to be in a public repository, and this, that, and the other. It depends what software they're building. But it's good enough for whatever they legally have to comply with, and then however much extra time they have on their hands, we can help them use that time to make the software better.
Does it depend on what type of software they are writing, producing?
Definitely, I think there's, I can't remember his surname, Vili, who gave a talk yesterday, was talking about classifying software, and I think there's some research software is a full software package or a simulation that hundreds of people will use. Some is a small library you share with your own group. Some is a script you run twice just for yourself. And the level of FAIR you need for those different things is different.
Do you want to follow on, Neil?
Yeah. how fair is fair enough? I think as long as you've shared your software with someone else, that is fair enough. And then everything else is just more fair.
Go to the questions. Oh, this is a long question. What are your thoughts on phishing? RSEs working as a postfix to apply FAIR to research code versus teaching to phish, educating researchers so that they write FAIR software themselves, and how to achieve balance this with the other pressures on their time.
I can try to take that one. Well, it's very interesting because when we try to train academics, I think we train people sometimes who are doing their PhDs, sometimes who are much advanced in their career. And I kind of always wonder, okay, if we start that even before, would actually solve a lot of the problems? Because if you start to install this in a master degrees that is really research-oriented, and you make them actually get credit for that, for their studies, okay, we'll actually learn this much more easily and much quicker, and that would actually spread completely around the community because that's part of their curriculum. And I would think that actually teaching people very early in their career is, I'm not sure I'm answering the question actually.
That's a vote for teaching to phish,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah, I would tend to try to teach the phish, but I'm not English speaking, so I'm not sure I understand
We'll explain it to you later, Roman.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's a question of balance to some extent, because if we take the analogy of software being a type of infrastructure, same as an electron microscope is a type of infrastructure, not everybody knows how to use an electron microscope, but you can still benefit from it. Some people are really good at using it, at using any type of infrastructure, and you want more people who are very good at doing the infrastructure. So I think you need to find the balance of saying, well, for some researchers who are just going to use a little bit of code, just knowing one or two things is good enough. And when they go beyond their skills, they can collaborate with RSEs or with somebody who's a specialist in making software fair. And it's not one or the other. It's about building collaborations with people who know how to phish.
Thank you. We'll have the next question. Oh, there's another question from the floor. Is there any interest to develop FAIR4RS to integrate further sets of principles, for example, the CARE principles? I don't know what the CARE principles are. Is Samantha in the room?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So CARE is, was formulated around data to understand kind of like safe and ethical ways of using data, particularly kind of coming from, say, indigenous communities and so on. So I think it's a really good point. So one thing I'll mention, because I see there's also a question, comment in from Dan, is that FAIR4RS software is doing its 2-year review, which you alluded to in the opening. And I think that's something that we're really keen to hear about, how people are using FAIR4RS software and might be trying to work alongside some of the other principles that are being developed at organizations like the Research Data Alliance and so on. So I think it is about integrating these principles, not kind of trying to push everything into one set of principles, because I think it works better being modular. But that is a good point to take forward as to whether for instance, CARE principles work well as they are just now with FAIR4RS software, or if the same sort of adaptation is required. And I confess I haven't looked at that, so it's a good point to make for the review.
Thank you. Can you go back to the slides? So the next topic is about how broad should FAIR4RS be. And I wanted to ask about whether there should be an extra R in FAIR4RS, an R for reproducibility. Roman, would you like to talk to this?
Yeah, so I mean, that's what you did at Sheffield, basically. So we call this program like FAIR with R square, to actually reproducibility. Because in the end, what you want to do with all these principles, it's to make science more reproducible. And all this, and there are techniques that are actually there to make your software, your workflows, or whatever you are coding more reproducible. And in the end, it all touched to the fact that we want to make this, all those software more open in a way that people can actually carry on the research, the next generation can carry on. So I think it's very important to include, I mean, I really like to include this R for reproducibility because that's one of the end goal, is to actually be able to carry on research for the next generation as the last generation did for us, basically. And adding this R makes it a bit more clear why we are doing this, and introduce some kind of new tools like virtual environments that are very useful for reproducibility, these kind of things. And yeah, I like FAIR Square.
Neil, do you want to?
So I have a slightly different take, which makes a more interesting panel, right? So I think it's a really good idea to introduce the extra R for reproducibility in the training, because ultimately the researchers that we're training don't really care about the FAIR principles. They care about what it gives them as researchers, and that is things like reproducibility, more collaboration, and so on. However, I don't think we should be introducing an R for reproducibility to the FAIR for research software principles themselves, because I think the principles themselves are all the building blocks for what I would call pragmatic reproducibility, without going into the actual trying to define what you need to do reproducibility. I think if we're going to do that, we should, in the same way as you have FAIR and CARE and so on, you should have FAIR and then another set of principles for going beyond pragmatic reproducibility. So I'm all for modular integration there, rather than kind of trying to do another, because I know we've done a lot of kind of going like FAIR-est to go into kind of like things like testing as well, which isn't in the principles. But yeah, ultimately for the training perspective, we should just be calling it reproducibility training, shouldn't we?
Sarah.
So I think in terms of adding it or not adding it, I would agree with Neil that I think it possibly should be kept separate, but I would disagree on the sort of, I guess, the hierarchy that you suggested, that I'm trying to think about it from a researcher's perspective and their journey of programming, and again, their motivation for what they're doing. I would put reproducibility somehow as a more fundamental thing than the FAIR principles, because I'm sort of thinking of the typical researcher's journey of write some code, do some science, publish a paper. The first skill we try and teach them is, can you actually write code? We teach them the languages and the software packages to actually do their own analysis. So we teach them how to simply make their stuff work so that they can get an output. The next level up then, I would say, is once you're publishing a paper, the scientific method involves reproducibility. You can't say a result is scientifically valid until it has been reproduced. So can you run that code again and do the same thing twice? Does it involve too many manual steps, too many made-up config files, or things where you messed with stuff or that only work when you run it on the one machine in the middle of the night? Or can you actually press play and do the same stuff again just yourself? And I'd say that is a more fundamental step to them than the FAIR principles, which are more, I would say, about sharing than getting external people to reproduce your work. Someone else to be able to find it, to be able to integrate it with their own tools or adapt it to their own data set. So if I was imagining a researcher's journey, I might teach them reproducibility before reusability and FAIR.
Carlos.
Can I rephrase or maybe more ask a question about the question? Because in my view, and that's why I wanted to have my laptop just to read it, software is both usable and reusable. Usable as it can be executed, and reusable as it can be understood, modified, built upon, and incorporated in other software. So to me, that already says it has to be reproducible. Otherwise, it cannot be executed. Yes, yeah, and that's just during the FAIR4 Research Software working group time, had lots of discussions on that.
This,
So and maybe it's just me being stubborn, but I think the spirit of it, it's there that you should be able to take the software, put it in another machine, run it. Isn't that what we need for reproducibility? Partly.
It's a fair point. So in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next. No, we'll just go into the next of these. Okay, so I wanted to move on to talk about funding, policy making, and to ask if funding bodies' policies are enough to persuade researchers to make their software fair, or if not, is there something else that we need to do? Carlos?
So I think that more than that funding bodies can persuade researchers to make their software fair, I don't think it's funding bodies that should be requiring researchers, and as in it's your obligation to do it, but more empowering researchers to, this is how you can make your, and how you can improve your software, or we are going to facilitate you, as in provide you funding for making your software more sustainable or more reusable in the long term. The Amsterdam Declaration of Funding Research Software Sustainability actually tries to push in that direction, that funders actually commit to making funding available for making software sustainable in the long term. So I think that funders do have a very big role to play there, and there are people pushing in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's quite important, isn't it, that the resource to support make that extra effort that is required to make software fair is available, and for that there needs to be the message from the top needs to be quite strong.
Yeah. So you need to make it, if you want to make it required, you also need to make it possible and make it desirable.
Yeah.
One as well.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think there are some funders. Again, I keep going back to academic motivation being basically papers, but the sort of impact we have for convincing an academic to do something, apart from the sort of bottom-up approach of talking to them and making them see why it's good for them, the pressures they have on them are funders and journals, and those are the people who set the rules by which they can publish their work. I think part of our responsibility of RSEs is to make them aware of those responsibilities if they don't think about them. I have seen a lot of grants that say any outputs from this grant have to be open source, but the researchers won't read that small text or understand what it means, and will not put their code openly. But I would encourage everyone to go and ask the PIs on their project, is your stuff meant to be open source? Because if it is, I'm putting this on an open source repository and you can't stop me. Or maybe ask them if they want to nicely, but you know. So yeah, the ones who are more resistant to the change are research software. I think you have that kind of pincer movement of we try and get their PhD students nicely trained and get the funders and publishers to put pressure on from the top. But again, I've seen when I was an astrophysicist, the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society started demanding that everyone put a data accessibility notice on all of their papers, and everyone simply copied the bit of text that says, my data will be available if you email me. And someone did an experiment of emailing 100 authors and got barely any responses, and most of them said, yeah, I've lost that data. So that didn't really help. Again, I think you can give them the motivation, but you need to give them the tools as well. You need to say, make your data open by putting it in this archive. Make your code open by using these tools, or here we will provide a training course. We will give you funding to go on the training as part of this grant. We are giving you a certain amount of money for software training or for RSEs to support you on this journey. Not just saying you have to do this, but you have to do this and here is how we will help.
As a bit of a follow-up, if funders, institutes require you to publish your research openly, does that mean that the software should be fair? Or is that a different set of requirements?
I guess, yeah, the minimum requirement for open is, is that justifiable? Does that make it open? Debate?
One of the things that we've got, which is in the original FAIR principles and also in the FAIR principles for research software, is this concept of as open as possible, as closed as necessary, because we appreciate that there are some things that you might not be able to fully open. So I think it is more about trying to make sure that it's sharing to the extent that is required, and ideally beyond that as well. And I think what funder policy does there is it can empower people to kind of go and talk to their PIs, perhaps, or go and talk to their institutions and say the funder is saying we should be doing it this way and we should be doing it this way. So it's not about persuasion there, it's more about empowerment, as Carlos said. And yeah, sometimes it isn't possible, and then how do you share it? It's still possible to make something fair without it necessarily being openly licensed.
Yeah, actually, I just have a follow-up questions. When a funder asks that the outputs are open source, is there any check after? Okay, well, here you go.
I think we'll move to some audience questions. Okay, I'll go to the bottom one first. It has more likes. Do you have experience in funding FAIR4RS practices via research grants? And if so, could you share tips?
So maybe this is not a very good tip unless you're based in the Netherlands, but the Netherlands eScience Center, we have a call for software sustainability call, which is made basically for supporting software that is already there and that you want to improve and make maybe more fair, or increase the community adoption, or just increase its functionality, make it more future-proof. But the aim of the call is really on improving the sustainability of your software. And I'm not sure if there's any European level funding that allows you similar things, but I hope that in the future it will be possible.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
If you're in the UK and you're being funded by someone like UKRI or a number of the other funders there, it is normally possible to put things into your grant which allow you to start making your software more fair by enabling some time, for instance, to do deposits and releases or improve metadata. In a lot of cases, it was previously put into exploitation and impact. So sometimes some funders also provide funds for like impact acceleration accounts to universities, and you can apply to that to do some work on the software that might make it more fair as well. So I think one of the things here is that it's not going to be called money to make your software fair. It's going to be different things that you'll see in the calls, which are really more around about exploitation, dissemination, reuse. So that's ultimately what you're trying to do when you're making your software fair, and there are ways of getting funding for that. Tends to be by looking at how you're doing exploitation.
There's also not thinking about the necessarily funding for the time or the tools to make your software more fair, but in terms of the training, organisations like the UK Reproducibility Network or the SSI or the Carpentries that individuals or organisations can buy into, that gets you access to the training. So if your university is a member of the Carpentries, you get access to the Carpentries training and the Carpentries instructor training. If you are part of the UK Reproducibility Network, you get access to our recently designed FAIR4RS course. So being part of groups that support these things to enable you to send your researchers, your PhD students on these trainings, even if it doesn't give you the time to then implement the changes, but at least you know what you're doing.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to just final remarks, and I'll give you each a minute or so to do this. Oops, sorry. I did have what the final remarks question was going to be, but obviously not on these set of slides. What are the next steps towards adoption of FAIR4RS in your opinion? And can we start with Samantha? We start with Sarah.
I think there are possibly just widening participation, I guess, that there are a certain subset of researchers who are engaged with the RSE community and are keen to learn new skills. These are often the more junior people in the academic community, PhD students who have more time for training, or people who just love coding, and a lot more often people in sciences rather than arts and humanities. So I think we do just need to talk to more people. We need to make more people aware that RSEs are a thing, that FAIR principles are a thing, that this training and support is out there, and that these principles exist to guide them, because you do still meet researchers who are in a lab or an office somewhere coding on their own, self-taught from blogs, and basically reinvent their own FAIR principles through trial and error and struggle and suffering. And we don't want that. We want them to feel part of a community and supported and learn things a lot quicker, because we can just send them on a training course.
Thank you. Samantha?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, actually. But I also think we need to do, especially in Finland and in the Nordics, we have a lot to do on outreach, on telling people that RSE exists, that people are not alone, not only to people who might be RSEs, but also to researchers, to make them aware that in actually some universities an RSE team already exists to support with that they're not alone, like that they know that there's a place where they can turn to, where there's maybe events happening or courses happening. Yeah.
Roman?
I think what's going to be important is trying to make people more aware that a software is a normal research output and it's not something new. And with the Ref 29, with this 5% of non-traditional output, I think there is a good thing to do there, with trying to push more software and to actually show that this is where research is done. It's not really the science paper. I think I've read that somewhere in some slides, that this science software is just the results. What's come before is actually the research. And that's where the software is, and making people more aware that this sharing the software is actually sharing your research. And when we will get there, FAIR will be everywhere, basically.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to repeat what everybody said, awareness raising, and I think that really starts from teaching at undergrad level, or maybe even before, that you want to share your software and share your data and share what you're doing in the most transparent way possible, and really just educating researchers that there's all this training, this possibility, this support from RSEs, and that it's part of how we do science in the modern age.
Yeah, these are all really great answers. I think I can only add like two other things. So one is, I think it's now the time where it's possible for us to start working to get organizations to, quote, adopt FAIR for research software and sort of make a statement that they think it's a good thing. And then that gives, again, it's another way of empowering people who want to do this to be able to do this. And then the other thing, and this is again around potentially training, I think it was Sarah that mentioned that the real key points to a shift in culture are journals and funders. And in particular, it's around the reviewers for journals and funders. So I think this training that we could probably be doing for journals and funders, reviewers, to be looking at the things that are coming in that they're reviewing and going, are these following the FAIR principles? Because those are the sorts of people that can care about FAIR principles. And I think we could certainly improve the adoption of the FAIR for research software principles a lot if that became part of the training for reviewers.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And I'd just like to acknowledge the help of Simon Hetrick, Roman Thomas, Neil Shepherd, and the wonderful team here at RSECon. And thank you for all of the great discussion with this panel. So thanks very much.